Oh boy, this is an exciting day. Canon has released its cheapest ever camera for the R mount, the Canon R50. It's a lot like the Canon M50, but it's now for the R mount, and it is quite updated. Now this thing is going to take direct aim at the little ZV-E10 in my opinion, because this is Sony's cheapest entry into the E-mount system. So we're going to compare the two. I mean, after all, the Canon is $679 and this one is $698 body only. So we should talk about it. So also we're going to shoot this whole video on autofocus on the Panasonic S5 II. Big thanks to Camera Canada for lending this to me so I could do some tests. Right now I am in the face and eye only detect autofocus. I will switch it halfway through to the human detect autofocus to see if it can pick up my humanness. And over here is my trusty little GH5 providing a second angle. Fantastic. So write down below in the comments if you think that the autofocus is doing anything wonky. But let's get right into the comparison between the ZV-E10 and the R50. People have already asked me about it, even though it's only been out for a few hours. And the thing is, they have a lot of similarities in the fact that they're about the same weight. This one is 364 grams. The Canon is 375 grams. They are both great hybrid cameras. They can take stills. They can take video. Their video is downsampled from 6K to 4K. They both have one card slot. They both have no actual IBIS, just E-stabilization. They both have 24 megapixel sensors. They can be powered through USB-C, and they can also stream directly through USB-C. Both have amazing autofocus, and they can also do 120 frames per second in HD. But first, let's talk about the advantages that the Canon R50, I'll be careful to not say the M50, which I want to say all the time. The R50, the advantages it has over the ZV-E10. First and foremost, I think, is the EVF, the electronic viewfinder. The thing you look through when you want to take pictures. This ZV-E10 doesn't have one, and the Canon R50 has a 2.36 million dot viewfinder, and on a sunny day, if you're trying to take pictures or you're trying to take video, that viewfinder is very helpful. In fact, for this guy, I actually bought this. It's a little LCD magnification viewfinder. You just stick it up to the back right there, and it helps you see your LCD screen. It is actually quite helpful and quite affordable. There will be a link in the description below. But of course, I would prefer if this guy just had an EVF like the Canon R50. And speaking of dots, the LCD screen on the R50 is a lot better than the ZV-E10. It has a 1.62 million dot LCD screen, and the ZV-E10 is less than a million. It's much more detailed on the M50. On the R50, it's much more detailed, and it's actually a touch screen as well, whereas you can only touch to focus or take a picture. With the ZV-E10, you can have a full touch menu with the Canon R50, which a lot of people are going to expect when they first pick up a camera. A lot of people are surprised that they can't touch the menus on the ZV-E10. Speaking of menus, we have the the old menu system for the Sony ZV-E10. It's a bit clunky, and a lot of people have trouble learning it. I know it by now, so I get through it very, very quickly. However, it did take some time to learn. A dullard like me, it took me many days. But the R50 is much more intuitive with that touchscreen, and the menus are laid out in a more sensible fashion. A really big one is like the R10, which has the same sensor as the R50. You can get an HDR mode. The HDR PQ can be in 10-bit. So you can get a 10-bit color mode on that little $679 camera. That is absolutely fantastic. That is a big win, in my opinion, for the R50. The R50 has focus bracketing, which is fantastic, especially at that price point. In case you want to say you're doing landscape photos and you want the thing close to you in focus and the mountain way out there in focus, you can just tell the camera to do it and it will focus bracket for you and make the picture. And in fact, it has a bunch of computational modes for beginners out there, so you can get better photos without knowing what you're doing. Now, they are only in JPEG, which is too bad, but still, it's nice that you can do that. They even have an HDR mode, and they have a night photography mode, so a bit like your iPhone, where you take a picture in the dark, and the camera does some processing and gives you a much better picture than if you just took it yourself. It also has no crop in any mode, and on the ZV-E10, you have no crop in 24 or 25 frames per second, but at 30 frames per second, you will get about a 10% crop, so it's nice that there's no crop at all on the R50. The R50 also has a really great auto detection mode. So if you have a human in your photo or an animal, a bird, a vehicle, it will just automatically choose that for you. On the Sony, if you want to photograph a bird or a cat or a person, you have to go in and switch that. You can do that as well on the R50, but you can also pick the automatic mode, which will pick it for you, and it does do a good job from what I can tell. So that is a really great advantage. There's also less of a crop in the digital stabilization. Like I said, no camera has IBIS in it, actual IBIS, but they do have electronic stabilization that comes in at a crop. So the R50 has two modes: regular digital stabilization and enhanced. And the regular one especially doesn't crop in very much at all, whereas the ZV-E10, it crops in about 40% when you use the digital stabilization. Now, the ZV-E10 has a trick up its sleeve. We'll talk about that when we get to the pros of the ZV-E10. And I'll give rolling shutter to the R50, even though it's really bad on the R50, because I know it's bad because it's bad on the R10. And when I compared the R10 to the ZV-E10, the rolling shutter was basically almost as bad, but I will still say the R50 will have slightly better rolling shutter than the ZV-E10, but both very bad rolling shutter. And now to talk about the ZV-E10 advantages, I have switched to the human autofocus on the S5 II. Let's see if this makes any difference. Do I stay in focus? Let me know down below. You, GH5, you are in manual focus because I do not trust your autofocus. Well, let's talk about the ZV-E10 advantages. The first one will be the headphone port. You can monitor your audio directly from the camera with the headphone port. The R50 does not have a headphone port. The R50 only has one dial for controlling, say, aperture and shutter speed, whereas the ZV-E10 has one dial here, and then the scroll wheel on the back can be used as well. So I use that one for shutter speed, and I use the top one for my aperture. And whereas with the R50, you will have to press a button to switch between the aperture and the shutter speed and control it from that one dial. That is a bit clunky. So you'll probably want to use the back screen. 11 frames per second mechanical shutter. Now, while the R50 can take 12 frames per second with mechanical shutter, with front curtain shutter, and also it can take 15 frames per second in electronic shutter, the reason it matters is because if you're shooting in RAW, which most people will want to do when they're taking their photos, you will only actually get 7 after the buffer, before the buffer fills up with the R50. So with the ZV-E10, then you can take more frames per second, even though you can do 11 for the burst rate and you can do 12 for the other. You can only get that 12 if you are doing JPEG. When you do RAW, it drops down to 7. And also the front curtain shutter is, you can't turn that off on the R50. And the thing is, on the ZV-E10, so you're going to have a better time with lower aperture lenses, because sometimes when you're shooting wide open and you have front curtain shutter on, then it can do strange things, especially to your bokeh. It can have things that get cut off strangely. So a lot of people like to turn that off when they're using very fast lenses wide open. So again, that's an advantage for the ZV-E10. This records gyroscopic data, which is absolutely fantastic. You can run the file through the free program Catalyst Browse and you get gimbal-like footage without using a gimbal. So even though it has a 40% crop in its digital stabilization, I almost never use that. I just turn off all stabilization, then I run it through Catalyst Browse, and everything looks really, really great. I love using it and I use it all the time. So the gyro data is a big win for the Sony. The gyro data will also correct the rolling shutter. The slow motion mode is better on this camera in my opinion, because you can use 120 frames per second with audio, and then you can slow it down, speed it up, do whatever you want, or you can record in S&Q, which makes the file for you in camera with no sound. Whereas the R50, it only does that latter. It just, you can only record without sound and it makes the file for you. And then also it spits it out at 30 frames per second. So I always shoot 24, but then my slow motion file will come out as 30 frames per second and all done for me. Much better implementation on the Sony. Speaking of implementations, the way it takes the white balance is far better on the Sony. You press a button and then you get a little square. You can even move that square around, press the button again, your white balance is set, and it tells you the Kelvin. It could be, hey, it's 5400 Kelvin that you just set the white balance to. That's great. Whereas Canon, they use an antiquated system where you have to take a picture in photo mode and then save that as your white balance and then switch over to video mode. It is a huge pain in the butt and I hate doing it. And also the histogram will stay on while you record with the ZV-E10. When you record with the R50, the histogram will disappear. There is product showcase mode in this camera, which I actually do use because you hold things up. Look how slow that was, huh? If I had product showcase mode on the ZV-E10 right there and I did that, it just boom, it would grab onto it right away. Now you can manipulate your cameras to get, put down some center focusing and turn up your autofocus on bust, and it can emulate that type of thing. But it's nice to have a dedicated button that you can just click on, do your product showcase mode, click it off, and go back to, say, your eye detect autofocus. And this also has a background defocus button where it can have the background out of focus or more in focus. But that is definitely a gimmick because you can do that with any cameras, aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. You can manipulate those things. So I never use that button, nor do I ever use the skin softening that is in the ZV-E10. So those are two things they like to say are benefits, the background defocus button for beginners and skin softening, but don't use those two things. I'm not writing those down as advantages. You have unlimited recording with this guy, whereas the Canon, it breaks it up into 60-minute clips. The battery life is a bit better on the ZV-E10. This one lasts about 90 minutes of 4K recording, and the R50 lasts about 75 minutes of recording from all of the reports. But again, after 60 minutes, you have to stop. Well, it stops it, and then you have to start again. The ZV-E10 is going to be much better in low light. I know that because I tested it against the R10, which has the same sensor, and the R10 fared much worse than the ZV-E10. So if you're going to do a lot of really low light shooting without any lights, the ZV-E10 is the way to go. But you should always bring lights or go to a place that has lights. Trying to shoot everything in very low light is a bad idea, but I don't know, maybe you're doing a documentary about how you like to dig tunnels without flashlights. In that case, the ZV-E10 is your camera. The ZV-E10 does give you S-Log 2 and 3 and HLG, but I wouldn't use the S-Logs with this 8-bit camera. It's nice that they put it in there anyway in case you do want to use it, but definitely I do use the HLG 3 all the time for great dynamic range out of this 8-bit camera. This also has zebras in both stills and video, whereas the R50 only has the zebras. In video, I actually like using zebras a lot for my photos. I put it on the sky, and when I see the skies blown out, then I just back down, my exposure a little bit, and then I know I got that sky in that shot. But anyway, now the last point for the ZV-E10 is a huge one, and that is lens selection. Canon is the only manufacturer that makes lenses for the R mount, and they don't have a lot of them, especially lower priced ones that are aimed at the APS-C market and wide lenses. They just don't have them, whereas Sony, they have plenty of their own lenses and plenty of third-party lenses. So since these cameras are aimed at beginners and vloggers and people who want to take their camera out and about, maybe film themselves, Canon really has an uphill struggle trying to come up with lenses that compete with Sony right now, because if you get the kit lens, that's an 18. It's the widest is 18, which is 29 millimeters by full frame equivalent if you take into account the crop factor. That is way too tight. So you probably have to get like the 16 millimeter f2.8. That is an R lens that you can get, but even that one is about 26 millimeters, which is still way too tight. Whereas the Sony, look at this. This is the 11 millimeter from Sony. You can get the 12 millimeter from Samyang, the 13 millimeter from Viltrox, the 11 to 20 from Tamron, the 10 to 20 from Sony, the 15 from Sony, the 16 from Sigma. Do you see what I'm saying? It's just and any focal length you go to, you can find lenses, many lenses for it, whereas Canon, I just hope that they let Sigma and Tamron come in and do their magic, because I've actually ordered the R50 and because I want to have it around. I want to test it out and see what lenses come out for it. And I'm a camera channel. I like testing out the cameras, but I actually don't know what kind of lenses I am going to get for it. I might have to buy an adapter for EF glass and then, get some of those wider lenses. But that's going to take down a lot of the portability and the form factor of the R50. So hopefully either they let other third parties come in or they come out with a bunch of lenses really soon. But right now, as of February 8th, 2023, very few lenses available. Certainly nothing wide that you can go out and vlog with. So that's it. So I think both of these cameras are absolutely fantastic, and they punch way above their price point in terms of image quality. And that is great to see companies coming out with lower priced things that can still give you fantastic images and video, and I certainly appreciate that. And I love testing these things out. You just have to figure out which one is good for you specifically, and hopefully this video did help you figure that out. Don't forget to write a comment down below, ask a question if you have one, and maybe leave a point that you thought maybe I forgot, and then I will be sure to ignore you and then seethe about it later in silence. Talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.